My name is Adva Saldinger. I'm a senior reporter at Devex, and I am here in New York at the Rockefeller Foundation. They've generously let us use their studio for this recording, which is a special episode of our This Week in Global Development podcast. And I'm joined by Andy Herscowitz, and you have a new role.
I do.
And it's part of a new announcement, a new initiative called the M300. So tell us a little bit about this initiative, which is really aimed at bringing power to people who don't have access to electricity.
So M300 is probably the biggest thing that's happening in international development right now in terms of what its ambition is. But in a nutshell, what it is that the World Bank and the African Development Bank announced that they want to bring 300 million Africans access to electricity by 2030. And just for context, you and I know one another when I was the coordinator for Power Africa from 2013 to 2020, but in the first decade of Power Africa, which in and of itself was the largest public-private partnership for development in the world, we helped, through partnership, 200 million Africans get access to electricity over about 11 years. We're now looking at trying to do 300 million more in just 5 years. And it's working through partnership with the World Bank and the African Development Bank in the lead, but the Rockefeller Foundation, the Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet, GEAPP, and Sustainable Energy for All, SE for All, are all working together to support this effort, and we're bringing in other partners as well.
So I know that the World Bank president, Ajay Banga, and the African Development Bank president, Adesina, they spoke earlier today here in New York, and I caught some of their remarks, and really they talked about needing a quantum leap in this space, right?
Yeah.
And so I'm curious how M300 and your role, how does that support what the banks are doing, and what do they need that they're not able to do now?
Yeah. So it needs quantum leaps in a couple of different areas, and that's part of why one of the reasons that I got involved in it. I got a call from Raj Shah, the president of the Rockefeller Foundation, and it gave me a flashback to 2013 when I was the mission director for USAID in Ecuador, and I got a call from Raj Shah, and he said, hey, there's this new initiative that President Obama is going to launch about energy in Africa, and we think you should do it. And I was like, I don't think I'm going to do that. And of course, I ended up doing it and loving it, and we produced, in a big way, but there was still a lot more that we needed to do. Very similar, I got a call from Raj on this. So I'm the CEO of what's called the M300 Accelerator. My role is to basically be a pain in everybody's rear and push all of these organizations to look at what have we learned over the last decade from things like Power Africa and also the African Development Bank's efforts, but also the technologies have changed, the approaches have changed. So when we talk about a quantum leap, so it's trying to do everything faster. It's looking at spending money differently than it's been spent before. So the Bridgetown initiative was largely, or is largely, about trying to change the global financial architecture. The Global South has been saying that it's not set up to help them succeed. M300 is an opportunity to show how the World Bank and the African Development Bank can do business differently. It's about also changes in technologies. So it's also the costs of the technologies have come down significantly. But it's not just the cost. The things that you can do related to energy access with mini grids have changed. So it used to be, you thought of a mini grid, you thought of some solar panels connected to people's houses, giving them some electricity. But now you see these mini grids that are being developed that are using Starlink to then also sell electrons for cryptocurrency, also selling electrons for localized AI learning and creating a mini data center that's been localized. They're making clean water from it as well. They're charging batteries to use in electric two-wheelers as well. So they're figuring out how to monetize all aspects of that mini grid. There's a company called Liquid Star that's doing this with a USAID grant in Djibouti right now. They have about 10 different income streams beyond just selling electricity to people. So all of these things are changing very rapidly. We've all learned a lot, so it's an opportunity to see if we can get this all to work together.
Yeah, and I mean, I think one of the things that was interesting in this conversation earlier is that they talked about part of the problem being everyone sort of jockeying for credit and not really working together. So how do you change that? How do you disrupt? These are institutions that are often very sort of set in their ways, and we can talk about it's not just the MDBs, right? It's kind of it's also some of the
Yeah.
philanthropy is in the space, it's also the government actors.
So the biggest critique I would get when we were running Power Africa was that people would criticize us, including the World Bank would criticize us, our European colleagues would criticize us, and even though they're partners, say, you're taking credit for what other people are doing. And I'd say that's exactly what we're doing. We're trying to make sure that everybody is taking credit for what everybody else is doing so that we are trying to figure out who is best positioned to deliver in some way and supporting that partner instead of everybody trying to do everything themselves. So one of the priorities for the World Bank, for President Bonga, is partnership. Well, if the World Bank is only supporting projects and taking credit for what they finance, how are they going to want to do partnership? There's a disincentive to work with somebody else, to have somebody else partner, to finance part of it. So this is also groundbreaking for the World Bank in that it's really promoting the partnership concept, making sure that everyone's working together with M300 being a big tent. So it's not quite the big tent that Power Africa was initially or became. I could see us heading in that direction because the reality is everybody who's working on this, what we care about is people getting access to electricity. Before I took this position, I went and spoke to my friends who are at the bank and the AFDB, the African Development Bank, SE for All, GEAPP, and I had two questions. I said, number one, are we all at the point in our careers where we don't really care what our next job is, but we care about what the result's going to be, which means that we might break a little bit of China, we're going to disagree on things, but we're pushing towards the result. And everybody kind of laughed and said, yeah, like we want to know that when we finish our careers that we've produced the results of people getting access to electricity. So everyone, we all have our egos, but we put it to the side for the most part, right, on this stuff. And the other question was, are we all still going to be friends when we disagree? Because all the people in the senior leadership, and even down at the technical level, everybody I talk to cares about the result. The answer is the failure isn't if, in 2030 the World Bank loses some money or the African Development Bank loses some money. No one will pay any attention to that. The failure is if 300 million people don't have access to electricity. So we're all going into it with that mentality, and it's fantastic. That's why I'm doing it. So I'm working with great people. And none of us has the exact answer, but we know that we're all willing to try different things out and see what's going to work.
So you talked about breaking some China.
Yeah.
What is the China that needs to be broken in this case? What are the things that have been tried that have not worked effectively? How do you need to adapt? I was just thinking back, looking at the World Bank, because obviously the private sector has to be involved, and IFC has this scaling solar program, and I wrote a piece looking into it, and it hasn't really been a booming success. It hasn't resulted in really scaling solar across the continent. So how do you look at past efforts and then try to make things better, try to learn from those things, and push these institutions to admit that certain things might need to change?
Yeah. I think scaling solar was actually a fantastic program, but there are certain things happen. So I've been one of the biggest supporters and one of the biggest critics of it as well. But it's not all the fault of the World Bank on some of this stuff. So what happens with a lot of these things is, expectations management amongst people. Sometimes it's the governments themselves what happens. So with scaling solar, sometimes the IFC did what it needed to do, but then the government itself didn't do what it needed to do, right? And so that's part of the issue. This is why it's so critical for M300 to be successful that this has to be African-led. This has to be led by the governments. It's got to be championed by the heads of state. When I look at the African energy landscape about what are the key hindrances, the key obstacles, it usually comes down to three things. And usually one is that political will issue. Are all the ministries aligned? So it's one thing for the Rural Electrification Agency or the Ministry of Energy to say, we want to do this and we're going to move forward, in a big way. But then if the Ministry of Finance comes in and says, that's great, but we're not giving you the money to do it, it doesn't work. So you need the head of state to champion it. Or if a government suddenly changes the rules of the game for investors coming in. Someone makes a big investment in a country and suddenly the tax regime changes or says, basically tries to pull out of an agreement. So it's real, that political will has to happen. The other piece is the capacity issue. A lot of the countries that lack electricity access, some of them have very, very small ministries. Some of them are small countries with small budgets. So one of the things we have to do is help make sure that the ministries and the right institutions have enough people in there to help them achieve what they need to achieve, and then also access to people who have the right types of expertise. And then we have to make sure that that expertise is localized as well, so in the long run. Third piece is currency, but it's really financing costs. So for before pre-COVID, and when Power Africa was launched for those first few years, you had really access to really inexpensive capital. But now the cost of borrowing is so incredibly high, and the cost of borrowing for the countries that need the money the most is even higher because a lot of them have low credit ratings. So it's not sustainable. So this is why what M300 is doing is bringing in huge quantities of concessional capital along with public financing, along with grant capital from donor governments, along with philanthropic capital to help de-risk projects, bring down the cost of the projects. The hope then is that will then crowd in commercial financing. So why does a company choose to not do a project in a country like Liberia? Right now, there's tremendous opportunities with subsidized opportunities in the United States with the IRA and Europe. There's all these incentives. The African countries aren't benefiting from that. Plus, they have high cost of capital. So we need to do what we can to get them the type of money that they need in order to develop the projects.
And that's where things like the IDA replenishment at the World Bank this year come in, right? So at the end of this year, IDA is the World Bank's fund for the poorest countries. They've set some pretty ambitious targets for the amount of money they want to raise. This is either grants or really low-cost loans that will go to the poorest countries. And that type of capital can help in a blended finance transaction to help them access markets as well, right?
Yeah, IDA is an absolute no-brainer for any donor country because what it does is the leverage that any country, whether it's the US or any of the countries that are contributing to IDA get is something like 39 or 40 to 1 based on the capital that they pay into that. So if you think about it like this, what IDA does is it brings down the cost of borrowing, but you have to look at it under the lens of, is it taking money out of the ODA budget? Yeah, it probably is, but that's okay because what are you doing? You're taking $1 out of ODA, but then you're using it to leverage a vast amount of money of investment from both public and private sector and from others as well. And so this is the idea behind the IDA is it brings really low cost financing that brings in private capital. Everyone realizes that the development ecosystem has to evolve. And there's a role for the private sector. This is what we saw with Power Africa. I used to tell a story where I'd say that after a few years of Power Africa, we did a rack up of how much money did the US government spend on Power Africa and what was the result. At one point, we had spent $500 million of basically US aid and some other money on Power Africa, but that led to 120 power projects worth $20 billion. And everyone would ooh and ah, and they say, wow, so you got like a 1 to 40 leverage on that, using that. But if I were to tell you that the IFC or the World Bank or someone financed 120 power projects worth $20 billion, but they lost $500 million on that portfolio, people would say, why did they lose that money? Now we have to replenish it. It's the exact same thing. It's a leverage. So the banks and the multilateral development banks and DFIs, all of their shareholders need to understand they need to stop viewing them as commercial banks. They have to view them as development institutions that just happen to use financing as a tool. And if it's a better use of that ODA or the IDA to leverage financing to make it go a lot further, that's a fantastic use of that money. But the shareholders themselves need to change their mentality.
The institutions themselves as well,
So,
right? Because
absolutely.
internally, there's a lot of people who are very risk averse, right?
Yeah.
And that has been ingrained in these institutions for a long time. So yes, if the
But it's
shareholders send a strong message,
because they have to go, and even President Bonga said this, like it's very uncomfortable to go back to your shareholders and ask them for a replenishment to spend it down. It's the shareholders that need to say to them, we want you to spend this money. We don't care what your return is going to be. We don't want you to be irresponsible. But when you look at USAID and its development credit authority that existed for 20 years doing loan guarantees, over that 20-year period, they only lost 4% on that entire portfolio. So that was a massive leverage of USAID dollars for the amount of money they pushed out the door. That's called development finance, with development being what you're doing.
So if we're talking about a need to mobilize a lot more capital in order to achieve these goals on the continent, what types of tools? Do we need to see more guarantees? Do more governments need to step up doing more guarantees? What other forms of financing?
Yes, 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 and yes. You have to look at everything that's within the development ecosystem: grants, technical assistance, financing, concessional financing, first loss guarantees. And you look at the problem that you're trying to solve and you say, what do we need to do to solve this problem? And you have to be willing to take risk on things. And you have to make it less bureaucratic. I'm going to give you an example. When I was at DFC, right, there was a company that DFC was going to make an equity investment in for $5 million, a solar company. And this solar company, to get that approval for that $5 million equity investment, which was going to get paid back, most likely, it went through incredible processes, including going to the board that the Secretary of State had to approve, because the Secretary of State is the chair of that board, which meant that you had hundreds of people looking at this $5 million equity investment. And I said to the board, I said, when I was the coordinator of Power Africa at USAID, I could have given one of my office directors the authority to just issue a $5 million grant to the same company, and nobody else would have had to approve it. Now, is that a good use of bureaucratic resources? In this case, we knew that we would never get the money back, but for an equity investment, it went through all these processes. So President Bonga is really trying to bust through a lot of the bureaucratic processes, reduce the number of people who have to be involved in approvals, and move things as quickly as possible. And by having this partnership, we're all coming together and we're spotting hurdles, and we say, can we simplify this process? Can we simplify that process? And everybody has this incentive to move more quickly.
So one question I have is, IDA funding typically goes to governments. So if governments are going to be getting a big chunk of this money, how do they need to be spending it? And how should that funding that is going to governments be targeted? Because there are certain parts of this ecosystem that can probably be done by the private sector, or the private sector with guarantees, et cetera. But there are parts of it that are really hard to finance through the private sector, including,
grid expansion.
Exactly.
So this is part of the challenge, is figuring out also, not only just for IDA, but even for the philanthropic capital, right? Like, I look at every dollar that Rockefeller Foundation and that GEAPP have, and I say, is this the best use of our money? Are we doing something that somebody else should be doing? So you have to look at that with everything. So you think through things like, what is private sector less likely to do? So grid expansion tends to be a public expenditure. Mini grids, though, they can be done through private sector investment, but they might need some level of subsidy. Just like there's government subsidy on grid expansion anywhere in the world, including the United States. It's subsidized in some way until people are able to make it financially viable. Transmission infrastructure also. So like looking at building out the transmission lines. It's not just about building the power plant, it's about building the power lines that then take it to like the substation, and then the distribution networks that take it to the houses and businesses. So the transmission lines and those distribution networks, they tend to not have the same like financial returns as a power generation project. But you can blend that to some degree and create incentives for private sector to come in. So you have to look at each of these things based on the expertise of the people on the ground and model it out to see what's the revenue model on this, and is it something that we can put enough public sector money and create enough incentives in that the private sector might be interested in it.
One of the things that
it's definitely not a one-off solution, and every country is different. Their needs are different.
I mean, one of the things that we've seen that's, I think, been a major barrier is actually the utility companies, right? Yeah. Often they're government-owned, often they're not particularly well managed, or they're close to bankruptcy, and so they're not reliable off-takers, right? Which becomes really problematic, and there's often a lot of waste in the system, and so they're not as efficient as they could be, so you might be able to use the power better if they improved. How do you make the case, because governments are going to have to crack down, right? Either they own them, maybe some of them will choose to privatize them, but something's got to change there for the system to actually function. And I think sometimes we've seen, I think an interesting example is with the Millennium Challenge Corporation. Their second compact in Ghana had a component where they said they were going to privatize the utility, and that was going to unlock a major investment from General Electric, and it was going to unlock a lot of money from the US government. Even with all those incentives in place, new government came into power, that didn't happen.
Yeah.
So money from MCC went away, GE didn't follow through on that, right? So
yeah, that's a whole, I know a lot about that one,
right?
so we can talk about that. But let's talk generally about it, because you're spot on about the utilities. Because in my ideal world, what would we do? We would go out to so one of the challenges with Power Africa was a lot of the connections that we counted, they were sales of solar home systems, because we could never accurately count the number of new connections that a utility had. And the problem, to a large degree, was that utilities themselves didn't know how many customers they had. And so we didn't have the baseline data to be credible in reporting out what the new grid connections were. But one of the best things that we did, and this goes back to putting people in places, was we put teams of people in 5 of the Nigerian distribution companies. And over a period of months, those teams of people helped reduce losses and improve collections. And they helped generate, I think it was like around $115 million in new revenues. So if you've got a utility that's willing to reform, this goes to like the political will at the utility level, by having people who go in there and help them do it, it's not a question of spending more money. You got to spend a little bit of money on people and technical assistance, but if it's generating that much more revenue, it ends up paying for itself. So I agree with you 100% that this is one of the things that we need to focus on, is helping them strengthen the utilities, but we need to work with people on the ground. There's got to be a desire for the reform as well.
Yeah, I mean, that seems to me like even if you do the other pieces, that can be challenging. One of the things I wanted to ask about is
But this goes to the partners on M300, like the World Bank, African Development Bank, everybody else, we can do everything right. But the governments themselves have to be willing to do their part and enforce it. This is the reason we're doing these compacts. So we're going to be signing compacts with probably about 15 countries during a head of state summit in Tanzania at the end of January. And there'll be an all Africa compact as well that lay out what everybody is committing to doing. Now, we've all been there before with compacts, right? MCC has compacts. So part of it is that we have all seen compacts before and we're skeptical about it. So we want to make sure that these compacts have some teeth in them.
And so a couple other questions. One of the things I wanted to ask about is, like, one of the challenges that I think the World Bank has mentioned, and Ajay Banga has talked about this, is that MDBs need to also get better at working together, and the philanthropies, because everyone has sort of their own processes. You talked about capacity at ministries, et cetera. So
we're doing it.
But how?
Okay,
right?
let me tell you. I've been on the job for 5 weeks. In my first 3 weeks, so at the beginning of January, or beginning of August, we launched something called it's a TA facility, TA Accelerator, whatever you want to call it. Rockefeller and GEAPP, the Global Energy Alliance, committed $10 million immediately. And we created a task force with members from the World Bank, IFC, AFDB, the SE for All, GEAPP, Rockefeller. There's a bunch of us. We sit and we meet, and we're meeting twice a week. We got 30 plus proposals coming in from World Bank and African development teams on the continent. They submitted them all to us. We reviewed them all. And within a couple of weeks, we've already approved about 15 technical assistance projects, I think in 10 or 11 countries right now, that are all meant to help move World Bank and African Development Bank projects. I think there's about 120, 130 projects already in the pipeline that are geared towards achieving the M300 goals. So we're all working really closely together. I'm on the phone or in email contact every day with people at all levels in all of the institutions, and we're all working seamlessly together.
And that's different.
It's totally different, but this is what we did with Power Africa. Like, we got the U.S. government to work together in a way that hadn't happened before. That's the way you make it work. You got to make everybody sharing information, kicking around ideas, working towards a common goal, common mission, trusting one another. Like, that was the secret sauce of Power Africa, and that's going to be the secret sauce of M300, where everybody lets their hair down a little bit and everybody rolls up their sleeves, and we all trust one another, and we realize, what do we care about? Is this going to lead to a connection, or not?
Yeah. So another question, and this is something that I think is kind of controversial in the climate space, right? So your goal is to get electricity to people. I know that the aim is to do that largely with renewable. Yeah. But a lot of African leaders have said, we're not going to give up on natural gas, for example. We need to create baseload power. We need to, and solar power can be great for a lot of things, but if you need reliable baseload, also to
Well, it's not that for productive use.
yeah, exactly.
To
And
power
so I think,
industry and things like that.
and that's a part of this, right? It's
Yeah.
about unlocking economic growth,
Yeah.
and if getting access to energy is sort of important to underpin that, you have to have really reliable baseload energy, right?
Of
So
course.
how do you look at that and think about that and balance sort of the climate objectives with the energy access objectives?
So Africa has the potential to be pretty much 100% renewable now. But this is where it goes to, so how does that happen? Right now it needs gas because a lot of the countries, they need baseload power in order to grow. And not every country has baseload renewable energy. So your baseload renewable energy sources are hydropower plants that are constantly running and geothermal plants that can produce steam 24 hours a
And that's why a
day.
country like Kenya can be
Of course,
almost,
it's very
yeah.
easy for Kenya to say, not easy, but they can say, we're 100% renewable right now,
I
we're
don't
the
think
only
they're
one.
100%, they're close.
But they can say that we will be the first country to be 100%.
Yeah.
Because they're sitting on geothermal and hydropower, which are baseload, which allows them to have wind and solar and all these things and balance it out. But a country like a Botswana or Namibia doesn't have huge hydropower or geothermal power. So what do they need? They need either coal or gas or something to provide them baseload, or they need to import electricity from other countries. Well, what if they imported that electricity from hydropower from Zambia and Zimbabwe? So those big, those big dams, the reservoirs, are actually serving as a giant backup battery for the region, and they're not necessarily producing the power, like baseload power all the time, but they're drawn upon in the evening when the sun goes away, but they're providing power to the whole region. So if you build out the interconnectors throughout the continent, and you've got strong power pools where they're trading with one another and they're trusting one another, you can have 100% renewable environment, and that's where we want to be. This is why we need to invest in all that infrastructure to make that happen. But in terms of getting people access to electricity, right now, what we care is about getting people access to reliable and sufficient electricity so that it promotes economic growth, supports job creation, supports industry.
So that means at least in the short term, gas is on the table.
Well, it's not that gas is on the table, right? We're looking at the access piece. So if it's a question, if it's a mini grid, like we're not rolling out diesel mini grids, okay? In fact, we're doing the opposite. You look at Nigeria, there's far more electricity in Nigeria being generated from diesel generators than from the grid, right? So part of what we're doing is figuring out how do you wean people off of those. Are there solar mini grids that you can create, solar battery options? So we are focusing on that in the mini grid space.
And that's an interesting
But
example.
like take a Sierra
Yeah.
Leone, right? Sierra Leone, if their power generation source, when I was at DFC financed a large gas project there. Great. But you can't credibly say that just because we finance that gas project, people are going to get access to electricity. Right. That electricity has to get into the grid, and there has to be a grid to deliver it to people's houses. So I would always say to people when I was there, like, just because you built a gas project doesn't mean that people are getting access to electricity. We're now going to say, because the electricity is there, we're going to make sure it gets delivered to houses and businesses.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think that's
But
an
our preference,
important piece of it.
obviously, for everyone is for renewables.
Yeah. No, and I think the Nigeria example is interesting because in some countries where it was like, well, you're giving people electricity, so what you're replacing is like kerosene lanterns and
Right.
and candles and things like that. It's like, okay, well, you need like a single solar power on a house might actually
Well, but
be
even for
sufficient.
cooking,
Yeah.
for cooking, right? So, what 3 billion people globally are still using charcoal, biomass, and wood for cooking. That's worse than cooking with gas.
Yeah.
So gas cooking is a cleaner option than what people are doing right
And
now.
healthier.
Correct. So our preference isn't like, yeah, this isn't like we want to favor fossil fuels. We're going to look for the best solutions that are the most sustainable solutions that will, and also as incomes rise. So even if gas becomes a cooking option for now, it may be a 10-year thing while people get connected to the grid where they can then be using electric cooking instead, induction cooking, all these other things. But as long as, so it's this economic model that you need to close the gap now, get people enough electricity so that their incomes increase so they can afford slightly, what might be more expensive technologies or those costs come down. And then eventually everyone's using electricity for everything.
How realistic do you think this goal is?
So it's quite realistic in that the World Bank and the African Development Bank have a pipeline of, I think, of 120 or 130 projects with very specific plans to try to achieve electricity access. As we all know, plans can get delayed, they can get off track, and part of what we're doing is to make sure that things stay on track and that we look beyond just the World Bank and African Development Bank to figure out what other partners can come in to help plug holes on this. So I like to think of it as M300 plus, because I hope we exceed the goal, right? We exceed the goal. And so if you see this level of commitment at such a senior level, and you have so many smart people at the technical level, I have tremendous hope that we can achieve this.
And how much buy-in do you think there is from African governments at this point? Because we've talked about how critical that's going to be.
I think for them, it's a no-brainer. We had at an event today, the President Boakai from Liberia was there. We had the Prime Minister of Tanzania. Tanzania will host this Heads of State Summit. I think there's tremendous buy-in. We're already heavily, we're deep into negotiating energy compacts with 15 initial countries. But when we have this leaders summit, there'll be others invited as well. See, these are the things you need to do. And so it's meant to just be a start. It's not, no one's being chosen. It's just, these are ones, we have to start somewhere. And the hope is that we can create a model that others can replicate.
How many, in terms of income distribution in those 15 countries, is it primarily low-income countries, middle-income countries?
It's a mix. It's mostly, I would probably say it's mostly lower middle-income countries and low-income countries. So it's not even like we chose, like the easiest places that already have high energy access. It's mostly low income. It's mostly countries that are eligible for IDA. So no one's shying away from the more challenging investment climates. In fact, we're diving into the most challenging investment climates.
Wonderful.
Yeah, I'm loving working with the people on this. So
yeah, it's interesting because we first met when you were at Power Africa. So it's sort of full circle also that you're in this.
I described it as, well, the band got back together, but now it's more of an orchestra. There's so many players involved in this, and so we all have our role in this, and it's incredible. We have incredible leadership at the World Bank. SE for All, Dami Lola, the head of SE for All. She's a technical person. She's one of the most brilliant people that who works on this. She's passionate about it. She and I get along extremely, extremely well. So it's like, we will feed off one another with ideas, but we'll all, Joseph Nganga also from GEAPP has been around, Kevin Kariyuki at the African Development Bank, the VP there. We're all talking, like, on texting, calling each other at all hours of the day, kicking around ideas. And they're really leading it from the continent as well. So everyone recognizes that, like what you said, this has to be African-led to be successful. I'm kind of the nudge in Washington, D.C. for all the big institutions. So it's what we all...
I feel like that's a role you're going to be pretty good at.
Yeah, I've become pretty good at it, so of being the nudge. So
great. Well,
excellent.
Andy, thanks so much.
Thank you.
It's great to hear about this, and we look forward to hearing more as all this develops.
Thanks. Thank you.